So we've heard a lot of rumors about fall sports and clubs becoming non-spectator events. How do you see that playing out? For example, would student sections be allowed and parents be allowed as long as they're taking into consideration the 6-foot rule?
Yeah, thank you, Tegan. So the Department of Health is working through that guidance right now. My office doesn't have a role on the safety side of this stuff, of course. That's all Department of Health. As I understand it, they're going to initially give us guidance on what the athletes can do for over the summer and preparing for fall sports. And then as the virus changes statistically and from a researcher's case, I think they're going to come out with additional guidance as we approach the fall for spectators, fans, student sections, all that. I think that's coming later. The first bit of guidance will be what are the parameters for the athletes to get back on the field.
So in the planning guide for reopening Washington schools, which is published on the OSPI website, OSPI commits to support inclusivity and engage in anti-racist work. What are the specific guidelines or plans that OSPI has in place to do this?
Yeah, so that's a set of value statements that we wanted the districts to know that we're going to look through our policies through that lens. One of the big ones we've undertaken recently is student discipline. It was significantly and disproportionately administered by race and, quite frankly, gender. Boys experienced it significantly more. So we've got very particular policies that we're diving into. That was a very big one for us. But what we wanted the districts to really understand is that we commit to the same sort of policy framework. A lot of us are doing our own work right now on implicit bias. We're doing that individual development. We wanted the districts to know that our office has taken another step here to try to look at systemic racism and anti-racist practices. So what are the policies we keep perpetuating that on face value might seem neutral, but in fact are very disproportionate? And so that's the framework of that. And obviously everything from SROs in our schools, how we administer our grading practices, how we treat attendance, all of this stuff has bias in it. And we're going to just keep marching through each of those things for as long as I'm here, at least, and trying to make progress. And we want our districts to know that we're in that journey with.
Do we have any updates on what the day-to-day model for schools will look like for next year? Because there's been things floating around about having kids not come to school every day and have like online some days and some school and then physical school other days and splitting it between grades. And is the office of the OSPI working on any new guidelines for that?
And so the guidance that we put out last Thursday begins to address some of this. And the task force really built some models, and they refer to them as a continuum. So on one extreme, everyone gets to come back and, yeah, we're wearing masks, which is very unusual, very unlikely. On the other one is everyone is full-time at a distance learning remotely. What the task force recommended were a couple blended models in there where some students come back first and then maybe the rest later when it's safer, or a recognition that we can't get everyone back with the space constraints that are upon us by the Department of Health. And so thinking about those integrated models where all students are some days face-to-face and some days online. So those are in the guidance and very high level because each district is completely building this on their own based on their unique needs. But I do want to clarify that it is unlikely that every student is coming back to school this fall. In fact, it's not going to happen. Some families are going to choose not to. Some of our teachers are at high risk and can't come back or won't. And then the space constraints put on us by the Department of Health on the 6-foot rule is going to make it very difficult. So almost every district, I think, will be in some kind of blended model.
With a recent push for ethnic studies in schools in light of the worldwide protest for Black Lives Matter, what are the steps Washington schools are taking to have ethnic studies in schools, and what is your response to the movement?
Yeah, so I'm enormously excited about the movement. As a former social studies person, my undergraduate degree is in this. I've had a real blessing that my degree was very much about ethnic studies, and it was called a lot of different things in the early 90s, but I took Chicano studies, for example, women's studies, Islamic studies. My journey was about trying to understand a very beautiful but complex world that sometimes comes together in conflict in the United States and elsewhere. So I'm excited about this. The legislature has recently passed legislation that has a team of folks around the state building first the standards, if you will, for ethnic studies, and then eventually they'll help curate materials for that. But our office doesn't adopt curriculum. We only put the learning standards in place, and then districts do that. That was originally going to be, I believe, a 7 through 12 or 6 through 12 look. And we've just said, hey, this has got to be kindergarten through 12th grade. You've got to build those skills around racial literacy and ethnic studies much earlier on and embedded in other parts of the curriculum. So that group is still going, and I'm really, really excited about it. Some of our districts are way out there already and know how to do this work, and others are just in infancy. But we will have a framework here within the next year about what the learning standards are by grade level, and then challenge districts to build it out. Some will put it in humanities and some will put it in social studies, and so it'll kind of depend on whether they're standalone courses, which I really think they should be, and some I think in the beginning will embed them in existing courses. But the journey is underway, and I'm very happy for it.
Hi there. So jumping off of Nathaniel's question about the reopening school guidelines, in that packet you said that your expectation is that schools will open this fall for in-person instruction, but obviously given the Department of Health's guidelines, how many schools or districts do you think would realistically open given the barriers?
Yeah, it's a good question. I honestly think almost every school will open. I don't think any school can meet the guidelines and bring everybody back in their traditional classrooms. So on one hand, I think most will be open and they'll bring most of the students back, or maybe their elementary and middle schools, or they're going to have these hybrid models. Some will be able to, a lot of our small rural districts have the space, the square footage, and the staff, and they can bring them back and have a relatively normal experience. But in Western Washington, particularly the Puget Sound and the larger districts, they will have a heck of a time meeting those space requirements. So I think you're going to see a blend almost everywhere. You will have a few dozen districts who can just flat out bring folks back. And maybe due to health restrictions, there'll be several districts in the fall who just can't even start face-to-face. Their local Department of Health will say, hey, the planning was good, but the overall conditions of health in the county aren't conducive for it. And local health departments have that authority.
So the pandemic has brought to light the many disparities in our community. How can schools help fix accessibility issues concerning low-income students and those with special education needs?
Yeah, I think for those of us who have been in the work a long time, we've observed these gaps for a very long time. The legislature's done a good job adding resources. Our students with disabilities get a very significant factor increase in terms of the investment from the state, which allows for those therapies, those individual supports, the meeting their IEPs. And so I think what was, I guess, a positive out of all of this is that everyone else has now seen and been exposed to how hard this is to create equity in a system. The minute you leave the face-to-face model in our schools and go online, a lot of those high-touch services, the mental health supports, the nursing, the counseling, the therapies, those are really virtually impossible to deliver, and those gaps just got bigger. And so I'm glad people are aware of it. It's why there's such a push to try to open schools to as many students as possible. I think the resources are primarily there. There's some more work we have to do. And now school districts have to make priority with the resources they have to close those gaps. So whether it's students with disabilities and getting them back in early or over the summer to make up for services, or it's buying connectivity for rural communities and rural families and low-income families who don't have a good Wi-Fi or broadband connection. This is what has now had light shined upon it. And at the state level, we're trying to purchase some of that connectivity, but our Office of Financial Management will not release $20 million that we need to get started on these activities. They've got a $8+ billion budget to balance, and I think they're using some of that money to do it.
Hi, so the pandemic has highlighted the lack of access to technology that many students have experienced the last few months. So as we look forward to this new upcoming school year, how will the issue of equitability and the access to it be addressed at a state level?
Yeah, again, the legislature is going to have to balance an $8.5 billion budget hole. But some of what my responsibility is to say, hey, you're responsible for taxing and spending, and you need to figure that out. But in the meantime, as the state's chief education officer, I'll be telling them that technology access needs to become part of basic education. So, you don't go to school and then suddenly get a $300 bill for your textbooks when you show up at school. There's sometimes a few lab fees and extracurricular ASB stuff, but basic education learning has to be covered by the state. And now people have seen how critical it is, not just in pandemics, but every day. You all know how much you need technology to be successful. We've got a generation of legislators who didn't live in that world, you know, so no disrespect to them, but I've got to bring them a policy framework and an expectation that they start purchasing universal connectivity for families.
So one of the things that's become prominent is that it's no longer feasible to have 30 student classrooms because on one hand, there's space constraints if every student comes back, but on the other hand, when it's online, it's become very clear that students aren't receiving the attention to properly engage in school. So what is going to be done to ensure there's enough faculty available for every single student or class?
You have just identified the biggest challenge for our school districts. They've got this health mandate of 6 feet, so they're rearranging their classrooms, and maybe they can get 16 in a lab class and maybe 24, 25 at most in a regular class. But if they've had normally 28 or 30, well, that's students they can't accommodate. So they're rechanging their master schedules to accommodate this. And as you point out, we don't have additional money, so we can't, even if we could put 5 more classes in a gymnasium, it's going to be very difficult to afford the certificated teachers who need to stand before those students. It's why I think most districts are saying we're going to do some kind of blended model. They're going to kind of do this every other day thing, a lot of them, where they're going to bring students in and they can only accommodate 24. They'll do that, and then there'll be an expectation for work at home on the next day while another cohort comes in. So the goal here is to try to meet as much learning need as we can, follow the safety guidelines, of course, but unfortunately have to do that all with existing financial resources. It's the biggest jigsaw puzzle I have ever observed public education attempt to pull off, and each district has to figure it out.
So Seattle Public School Board announced June 10th that they would be cutting ties with the Seattle Police Department for 1 year in response to the Black Lives Matter protests. Do you encourage other school districts to take steps to remove police from schools, and why or why not?
Yes, so there's no state appropriation for this. This is local school district decision making, and we have a very different experiences. We have districts that are full on contracts with law enforcement, officers, so commissioned officers with uniforms and full gun, and then we have districts who don't do any of this stuff. So we won't land on a single policy, but I will be advocating with the legislature to remove armed personnel from our schools. I've never thought that was appropriate. Some communities really like having SROs there, and again, some are commissioned in non-uniform, and so they really act as a dean of students. They act as support, but in some communities, there is such remarkable trauma by the presence of law enforcement, particularly when they are armed in our schools. So I will support legislation that removes armed SROs from our schools, and then definitely leave up to the local districts whether they want to maintain those contractual relationships locally or not. We clearly have to focus on safety. That is such a priority, but there's no research that we understand that creates a safer school because there's an armed officer there. Unfortunately, some of the highest profile shootings in this country have been at schools with armed officers. Do you plan to keep morale up if the problems happening in this current year are not resolved by the beginning of next school year? All right, thank you for that awesome question. I don't know. That's an answer for the state superintendent that's a little bit baffling because, you know, morale is really a function of community. It's a matter of how much we rally and understand what's possible and whether or not there's dissonance between what people get. So what is our expectation versus what we get? And this was a very humbling 12 weeks for a lot of school districts, a lot of students and families and teachers. I believe our districts have gotten better about this. We have guided them that if they're going back online, for example, they've got to narrow their learning management systems. Some of you experience 4 or 5 different systems from 4 or 5 different teachers. We've got to have professional development in the learning management system so our educators are really comfortable at using the tools. And then the other thing we have in our guidance is districts really need to adopt set schedules for students. It can't be, hey, stay tuned, and each teacher will get to you when they get to you. There's got to be like on Mondays, we're doing social studies and English and science, and we're here for 3 hours, and you're going to have instructional time. There will be independent learning with it. We're really challenging districts in what we call continuous learning 2.0 to have a very formal framework about that. if we can get students connected and districts can really build some discipline about that, I think the morale will improve. People will understand that there's a way to get better at this. But again, our ultimate goal is to get as many students in as safely as we can, because we think being in our buildings is the best thing for morale, mental health, camaraderie, just the relationship building, the academic learning, as well as the social emotional learning. So as many as we can safely, and then be better at distance, and hopefully make some real progress.
Adding on to what Annika and Una said earlier, are there any new OSPI initiatives specifically regarding the recruitment of diverse teachers and staff to help correct disparities within education?
Yeah, so a couple things in this space. I keep giving you these answers. Like you guys are going to go, what is it you do? So the Professional Educator Standards Board is separate from us, and they have the authority to set standards for our teachers. So they direct what the higher ed institutions are doing to prepare teachers. They definitely have initiatives about this. And it is wrapped up, again, in some implicit bias and institutional racism around formal assessments, for example, that keep a lot of people out, even though they would be fantastic educators. So in our office, though, we have the Beginning Educator Support Team, for example, the BEST program. And what we do is we try to train school districts on practices of mentorship. So our role really is about retaining. We are growing our educators of color, and it's improving right now. It's slow, but it's improving. And the goal, though, is it's not enough to just recruit and bring folks in. We really want to build supports and keep them. And that's what that team does. It mentors one-to-one and pairs them with an experienced teacher who can really support them. And we're getting very good results. Districts that use the BEST program have better retention. Now, I will say at our last data look that we had a very interesting thing emerged. And it appears that our teachers of color who come in, they don't leave us at any higher rate than our white teachers, our Caucasian teachers. They stay with the system in the same ways. What they do, though, is they leave and tend to find school districts where they feel a lot more support. So they're looking for communities where they have peers like them, and probably students who are more reflective of their demographic. And so we're concentrating our teachers of color in particular districts in this state. And so on one hand, it's awesome that we're getting more diverse in our teaching core. On the other hand, a lot of our districts have to figure out what it is that would allow them to recruit and retain, so that everyone's getting the benefit of a really diverse and really rich set of experiences from our educators. We just know that if a young person of color has even one teacher of color, they are much more likely to stay engaged, graduate, and consider teaching themselves.
Okay, my question was, you mentioned that with the new COVID-19 modified school plan, there's going to be a blended model, specifically as each district faces different restraints in maybe health standards or accessibility to spaces. Have there been any discussions about how these options could impact specific learning standards, specifically about framework or curriculum? And if so, what have been some of the solutions or concerns that have been presented or talked about?
Yeah, really sophisticated and awesome question. Not as much about the standards, because those get reviewed periodically. We want math to be math by grade level, age appropriate. I think the bigger conversation is, do we need all the credits that we expect, particularly of our high school students? Are there things we can let go of even in the short term, because it's just going to be so hard for students to get all the classes that they need? And so we're in a conversation with the State Board of Education right now on whether we need to expand the 2-credit waiver to be bigger and longer. And then, pretty honest conversations about things like, if you could have success in 10th grade English, why wouldn't we put you in that when you go to high school? And if you have success, just automatically give you credit for 9th grade English. Why make you go through that regimen, right? So those kinds of efficiencies where it's really about students demonstrating proficiency or mastery and not just seat time, right? Not just going through the same formula as everybody else. That kind of stuff we are trying to get the legislature to be really creative about over the next couple of years. Now, I will just say thank you for your work in really understanding the concepts of journalism and asking awesome questions. I really like this because I want to support you and I want you to hold me accountable. So it's pretty cool in that regard. I will say, as just a general message we didn't talk too much about, it's just the unfortunate ideological divide that's happening in the country that's landed in our state. So something is important as masks, which we don't even control, right? The Department of Health is going to require face coverings as we return to school. It is so fraught with political ideology, and I totally get it, right? I really get it from both sides, from that sort of personal perspective that people have. But I guess I am struck by the fact that we are tasking people to really be sacrificing what they perceive as an individual liberty for the better of the whole. Masks are a perfect example. They don't really protect you, they protect others. Like washing hands protects us, because then when we touch our face or our mouth, we don't get disease. But the mask is about keeping droplets from spreading to other people. And so it's an observation. I share it with you because I share it with a lot of audiences that the old social studies teacher in me is fascinated from a social studies standpoint about how the politics of division creep into something as simple as face masks. But it's not simple. It's really guttural for people. It's intrinsic to them. And there's a battle going on right now in our state about that and in other states. And our observation is when we look at about a dozen other countries, the students didn't have nearly as much problem. They say, hey, this is what we got to do. This is what we got to do. It's an adult ideological fight. And I just challenge you all as students to ask your peers whether or not they're going to have a problem with that or not, because we'd like to hear from you. We're hearing a lot from the extreme political ends from the adults, but I'd love to know if students are experiencing the same rift amongst themselves about face coverings.